Welcome to Late Night Lectures by Night Shift Audio. I'm glad you're here. You don't need to take notes. You don't need to stay awake. Just listen, breathe, and let the information move past you. If you'd like to return for future lectures, you can follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. New episodes are released each Sunday night. Let's begin. In the dim recesses of prehistory, humans began the slow journey of recording information. Long before the age of books, the earliest records took shape as simple marks and tallies, precursors to writing that allowed people to remember and store knowledge. The very first archives were not libraries as we think of them today, but collections of clay tokens and scratches on bone that kept track of goods or seasons. As writing emerged in the earliest civilizations, these humble records grew into organized repositories of information. From these ancient storehouses of clay and papyrus would evolve the great libraries and archives of the world, each transformation reflecting the needs and dreams of its society. In this gentle journey, we will trace the history of libraries and archives from their earliest beginnings to the digital age, exploring how each era built upon the last in preserving humanity's memory. Earliest records in the first archives. Nearly 5,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, writing was born, and so were the first archives. In ancient Mesopotamia, as the Sumerians developed cuneiform script on clay tablets around 3500 to 3000 BC, they also began storing those tablets for safekeeping. These earliest archives were simple collections of records, inventories of grain, lists of taxes, contracts, and administrative accounts. In the city of Ebla in today's Syria, for example, a royal palace room from around 2300 BC held about 2,000 clay tablets, neatly arranged, mostly recording economic transactions. Other early archive rooms have been found at sites like Nippur in Mesopotamia and Hattusas in Anatolia, showing that by the 3rd millennium BC, societies were collecting written tablets in designated places. These proto-libraries were typically part of palaces or temples, serving kings, priests, and officials. They marked the transition from memory and oral tradition to written history, the moment when information could be stored outside the human mind and revisited generations later. Even as these records were utilitarian, containing grain accounts or legal decrees, they set the pattern for preserving knowledge. Clay proved to be a durable medium. Once dried, tablets could last millennia. Ancient archivists developed methods to organize them, inscribing titles on a tablet's edge or grouping tablets by topic or size on shelves. In a real sense, these rooms of clay tablets were the first libraries, though they were accessible only to a small class of scribes. In ancient Egypt, a parallel development took place. Temple and government scribes wrote on papyrus scrolls, storing them in wooden chests or rooms as state archives. Few of those papyrus scrolls survive today, but records show that Egyptians too organized archives of contracts, letters, and religious texts. From Mesopotamia to the Nile, the idea had taken root that written words were valuable treasures, things to collect, protect, and preserve for the future. Mesopotamia, the first great libraries. Over time, some ancient rulers looked beyond everyday record-keeping and sought to gather the full breadth of knowledge in their realm. One of history's first great libraries was the Library of Ashurbanipal in Mesopotamia. Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria in the 7th century BC, was unusual for his era. He prided himself on literacy and scholarship. He dispatched scribes across Mesopotamia to copy or collect texts on all subjects for his royal library. The result, uncovered by archaeologists at the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, was a collection of over 30,000 clay tablets carefully organized in 2 rooms. These tablets did not only contain administrative records. Ashurbanipal's library was rich with literature, science, and myth. Modern scholars were astonished to find in its ruins the epic tale of Gilgamesh, ancient myths of creation, medical texts, legal codes, omens and astrology, and manuals for scribes, a vast trove of Mesopotamian culture. In a sense, this was the first systematically curated library in history. Clay tablets from Ashurbanipal's collection even bear colophons naming the work and organizing series, an early form of cataloging. Though intended for the king's royal contemplation, this library's breadth shows a vision of knowledge as something worth gathering in itself. Remarkably, when Nineveh fell, many tablets were baked in the resulting fires and thus preserved. Thousands of these ancient documents now reside in museums in London and Paris, allowing us a glimpse into a long-ago library. Other Mesopotamian cities also maintained archives that edged toward libraries. The Sumerian city of Ur, the Babylonian kingdom under Hammurabi, and the great cities of the Assyrians all had collections of tablets. By about 1200 BC, even private individuals like merchants or scholars kept small archives. For example, at Ugarit on the Syrian coast, a private house archive held letters and teaching texts alongside myths. These collections were the seeds of libraries. Though not open to the public, they preserved knowledge beyond a single generation. Literacy was limited in these societies, so these early libraries served a small elite. They were often housed in temples or palaces, places seen as sacred or official. Knowledge was power, and writing was almost magical, a secret skill. Still, within these clay wall rooms, humanity's recorded memory steadily grew, tablet by tablet, awaiting rediscovery thousands of years later. Ancient Egypt, papyrus scrolls and temple libraries. While Mesopotamia stored words on clay, ancient Egypt developed papyrus, a paper-like writing material, and created its own tradition of archives and libraries. Throughout the Egyptian kingdoms, temples and royal administrations kept archives of papyrus scrolls, meticulous records of taxes, census lists, religious texts, and administrative correspondence. Because papyrus decays easily, relatively few examples have survived. Much of what we know comes from later writings or bits preserved in the dry Egyptian climate. But we do know that Egyptian scribes revered writing and that libraries were held in esteem. An inscription from a royal library founded by Pharaoh Ramses II in the 13th century BC called it the House of Healing for the Soul, suggesting that Egyptians saw a library as a place of knowledge and spiritual cure. That library reportedly contained official documents, literature, works of philosophy, and scientific knowledge, a broad collection for its time. It's a poetic image, an ancient library as a clinic for the spirit, where written wisdom heals the mind. Because so few Egyptian papyrus libraries survived, each fragment offers a tantalizing hint of a larger practice. In temple complexes, there were often rooms known as the House of Life, which functioned as scriptoria and libraries for the priestly scribes. Here, priests copied and studied texts on ritual, medicine, astronomy, and theology. Knowledge was guarded as sacred. Only trained scribes and priests could access these collections, and many texts were esoteric. Still, through such quiet labors, Egypt contributed greatly to the continuity of written knowledge. Egyptian libraries, like Mesopotamian ones, were not public but served the state and religion. The majority of people in ancient Egypt, as elsewhere, were illiterate, so libraries did not yet serve a general educational role. Instead, they were storehouses of authority and wisdom. Pharaohs and high priests sponsored these collections to bolster administration and ritual, and perhaps, like Ramses II, out of a recognition that preserving knowledge was itself a pharaoh's legacy. Even as papyrus scrolls turned to dust over the centuries, the idea of the library as a place of wisdom endured, passed on to new civilizations through the Greeks and others who marveled at Egypt's learning. Classical Greece, foundations of the library tradition. As literacy and learning spread through the classical Greek world, the nature of libraries subtly began to change. In the 5th century BC, Greece saw the rise of private book collections, scholars and philosophers accumulating scrolls for their own study. A culture that valued inquiry and debate naturally gave birth to collections of poetry, drama, history, and philosophy. By the time of Plato and Aristotle, it was common for an educated person to have a small library. Aristotle himself famously amassed a large personal library, which later influenced the development of the Great Library in Alexandria. These Greek collections were still limited to the elite, but they represent a shift. Books were not only tools of the state or temple, but companions of intellectual life. The pinnacle of ancient Greek library culture came not in Greece proper, but in Hellenistic Egypt. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BC during the reign of the Ptolemies, became the most celebrated library of antiquity. According to tradition, Ptolemy I, or his son, Ptolemy II, established this library as part of the museum. Their goal was breathtakingly ambitious, to collect all the books in the world. At its height, the Library of Alexandria may have housed anywhere from several tens of thousands to several 100,000 scrolls. Accounts vary, but ancient sources speak of figures like 400,000 or more. What made Alexandria's library special was not just its size, but its spirit of open scholarship. The library welcomed scholars from Greece, Egypt, and beyond to study and exchange ideas. It employed librarians who classified books by subject, author, and title, creating one of the earliest library catalogs. Within Alexandria's halls, legendary thinkers like Euclid, Archimedes, Eratosthenes, and Zenodotos worked, editing texts, comparing versions of Homer, or calculating the Earth's circumference. The library was thus a true center of learning, where copying, translation, and commentary on texts propelled knowledge forward. For roughly 3 centuries, Alexandria's library flourished, setting the model of the research library. A collection meant not just to store information, but to generate new knowledge through study. Outside Alexandria, other Hellenistic cities also built notable libraries. The city of Pergamum in Anatolia developed a library said to rival Alexandria's, holding perhaps 200,000 scrolls, and even inventing a new writing material, parchment, when Egypt embargoed papyrus exports. In Athens, the great philosophical schools had libraries. By the 2nd century BC, Pergamum, Athens, Antioch, and Rhodes were all known for their collections. These libraries often benefited from royal patronage or the wealth of scholars, and they exchanged texts among themselves. Libraries had become an ideal of enlightened leadership. Kings and cities took pride in building repositories of knowledge. Notably, these were still largely elite institutions, not public libraries in the modern sense, but they sometimes allowed visiting scholars or citizens of high status to use the collections. Through the Hellenistic age, the idea took root that a city was civilized if it had a great library, a treasure house of writings that reflected the wisdom of the ages. Classical Rome, public libraries and imperial archives. The Romans inherited the Greek love of books and took it a step further by establishing the first libraries open to the public. In the late Republic, Roman statesmen and aristocrats avidly collected Greek and Latin works. By the 1st century BC, some private Roman libraries were quite extensive, filled with scrolls of philosophy, poetry, and rhetoric. The scholar Cicero, for example, had a notable collection and wrote about arranging his books in beautiful cabinets. As literacy and the book trade grew in Rome, leaders saw value in making libraries a civic resource. Julius Caesar is said to have envisioned a grand public library in Rome. The honor of creating Rome's first public library went to one of Caesar's lieutenants, Asinius Pollio, around 39 BC. Pollio used war booty to fund a library in the Atrium Libertatis near the Roman Forum, and he made its collection accessible to anyone of literary pursuits. This library was revolutionary in design. It featured separate rooms for Greek and Latin works, reflecting the bilingual culture of educated Romans. Pollio's example was eagerly followed. The first Roman emperor Augustus established 2 more public libraries in the city. Subsequent emperors such as Tiberius, Vespasian, and Trajan built additional libraries in Rome, each striving to outshine the last. By the 2nd century AD, Imperial Rome boasted perhaps nearly a dozen public libraries scattered across its neighborhoods. Most were situated in forums or bath complexes, serving as both repositories of culture and pleasant places for study. A typical Roman library of this era was a grand hall with walls lined by recessed shelves holding scrolls. Readers did not directly browse the shelves in the way we do now. Instead, they would ask an attendant to retrieve works for them. Reading or copying was usually done on-site in the reading hall. Lending of scrolls was rare, though there are a few recorded instances of it. Many Roman libraries were part of larger cultural centers. For example, the public baths, which were social and educational hubs, often included libraries so bathers could read after exercising. In addition to these public libraries, private libraries flourished among the Roman elite. Wealthy Romans like Lucullus and Trajan's advisor Pliny the Younger invited friends to peruse their collections, and having an extensive library became a mark of status. Nonetheless, these private hoards often ended up benefiting the public. Many were later donated to temples or emperors and became part of public collections. It's important to note that even Rome's public libraries were limited to a literate minority. The world of readers mostly comprised politicians, lawyers, teachers, and students, perhaps a few percent of the population. Still, the societal role of libraries was expanding. They were no longer just for kings and priests, they became civic institutions meant for the edification of any educated citizen. Alongside libraries, state archives in Rome also grew in sophistication. The Romans kept their official records, Senate decrees, census data, military logs, in a centralized archive known as the tabularium on the Capitoline Hill. Together, the presence of libraries and archives in the Roman Empire shows a recognition that preserving writings, whether literature or state records, was vital to the empire's identity and administration. By the end of antiquity, the Mediterranean world was dotted with libraries from Rome to Alexandria and Constantinople, containing the accumulated intellectual heritage of Greece, Rome, Egypt, and the Near East. This foundation would prove crucial when the tides of history turned, and much of this knowledge faced the risk of being lost. Medieval monastic traditions, libraries in the cloister. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, Europe entered a turbulent period. Many classical libraries were destroyed or dispersed in the upheavals. Learning and books found refuge in the monasteries of the Christian Church. Throughout the early Middle Ages, roughly the 6th to 12th centuries, it was primarily monks who preserved and copied books, keeping the flame of knowledge alive. In the 6th century, Saint Benedict of Nursia's monastic rule explicitly instructed monks to read sacred texts daily, which meant every monastery needed books and a place to keep them. As waves of instability swept outside, monasteries became islands of peace and continuity. They set up scriptoria, special writing rooms, where monks laboriously copied manuscripts by hand, letter by letter. Alongside the scriptorium, a monastic library would hold the completed volumes, often in cupboards or armaria, and later on shelves or locked chests. These libraries were usually modest in size, but immeasurably important in function. A typical early medieval monastery might have only a few dozen to a few hundred books. A collection of 600 volumes was considered enormous in the Middle Ages. The books were handwritten codices made of parchment or vellum. Copying was an arduous task. 2 fingers hold the pen, but the whole body toils, as a weary scribe complained in one monastery. Monastic scribes focused first on religious texts. The Bible, commentaries, service books, and writings of the Church Fathers would form the core of a library. Yet, despite a prevailing religious focus, many monasteries also preserved classical Latin literature by copying works of Virgil, Cicero, Aristotle, and others. The surviving library catalogs from medieval monasteries show that after the Bible and theological works, a section, often much smaller, was devoted to secular subjects like grammar, logic, medicine, history, and classical poetry. Without the quiet, devoted work of monastic librarians and copyists, countless ancient texts would have vanished. Monasteries in Ireland, England, France, Italy, and Germany became safe havens for books, exchanging copies with each other and thus slowly disseminating texts across the continent. Some notable early libraries include the one at the Bavarium Monastery in Italy, established by the scholar Cassiodorus in the 6th century. Cassiodorus, a former Roman statesman, founded Bavarium explicitly to save books that he feared might be lost. He urged monks to copy and preserve the literature of antiquity alongside scripture. Although Bavarium's collection eventually scattered, Cassiodorus's vision spread to other houses. By the 8th and 9th centuries, under the Carolingian Renaissance, monasteries such as St. Gall in Switzerland and Fulda in Germany became renowned centers of learning with relatively large libraries. The plan of St. Gall even allots space for a library next to the scriptorium, showing the institutional importance of books. Typically, these libraries were not open to the public. Only the monks and perhaps a few visiting scholars or clergy would use them. But in their solitude, the monks performed a service for all future generations, transmitting knowledge forward in time. Thanks to them, Europe still had the raw materials of learning when conditions improved and universities arose. It's also worth noting that outside Europe, Byzantine and Islamic lands were flourishing, and even within Europe, the later Middle Ages saw expansion beyond monasteries. Cathedral schools and the first universities also built libraries. These early university libraries, like that of the University of Paris or Oxford, were still small and often chained their books to desks to prevent theft. By the 14th century, we even have examples of public reading rooms in some Italian cities, which allowed lay scholars to consult books on site. Those developments, however, belong to the late medieval and Renaissance periods. Through the Central Middle Ages, it was the monastic library tradition that kept learning alive. Monks and nuns treated books with reverence, sometimes decorating them with beautiful illuminations, and saw their libraries as treasuries not of gold or jewels, but of wisdom. In dark times, these little rooms filled with parchment and quills were quiet lanterns of civilization, preserving the heritage that would later help reignite intellectual life in Europe. Libraries of the Islamic Golden Age. While early medieval Europe kept learning on a quiet simmer, the Islamic world blazed forth in an age of scholarship, often called the Islamic Golden Age. Libraries in the Islamic realms not only preserved ancient knowledge, but greatly expanded it, becoming truly dynamic centers of learning. After the rise of Islam in the 7th century, there was a strong impetus to collect writings, initially to preserve the Quran and Hadith, which were the foundation of the faith. Every mosque of note began accumulating religious texts. But soon, as the Islamic Empire grew, scholars turned their attention to the knowledge of other cultures. A key development was the introduction of papermaking to the Muslim world. In the 8th century, Muslims learned the art of making paper from Chinese craftsmen, and by the 9th century, paper mills were operating in places like Baghdad. This made books much cheaper to produce than laborious parchment scrolls, like triggering an information revolution. Suddenly, books became more abundant, and libraries could grow far larger than before. By the 9th and 10th centuries, large libraries had sprung up in many cities of the Islamic world, from Central Asia and Persia to the Middle East and North Africa. The Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad were especially famous for their patronage of learning. Caliph al-Ma'mun, for instance, founded the Beit al-Hikmah in Baghdad in the early 9th century. The House of Wisdom was part library, part academy, a place where scholars gathered to translate the great works of Greek, Persian, and Indian science and philosophy into Arabic. It contained a rich library of texts in many languages. Astronomers, mathematicians, doctors, and linguists could all be found working there, reflecting how libraries in the Islamic world became active workshops of knowledge, not mere storehouses. From this translation movement emerged Arabic versions of Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, and many other classics, along with original advances in algebra, optics, and medicine by Islamic scholars. Other caliphs and viziers in Baghdad established their own libraries. By the 10th century, one could find specialized libraries on subjects like astronomy or medicine, and public libraries where any student or scholar could read and even borrow books. Libraries were truly widespread in Islamic civilization. Historian Ibn al-Nadim in the 10th century compiled a catalog of all known books and authors, revealing the vast scope of literature available. In Córdoba, Spain, then the capital of Islamic Al-Andalus, Caliph al-Hakam II gathered a library said to number over 400,000 volumes. We have accounts that the catalog of this library alone filled 44 volumes of listing. Over 500 people were employed just to maintain and copy books for the Córdoba libraries. Al-Hakam II's agents scoured the Middle East for rare books to copy, and his library included works in Arabic, Latin, and Greek, making Córdoba a celebrated center of learning. It was said that 70 libraries existed in Córdoba by the 10th century, including those of mosques, madrasas, and private collectors. Other major libraries of the era included the Library of the Fatimid Caliphs in Cairo, which reportedly held hundreds of thousands of volumes, and the libraries of Persian cities like Shiraz, where patrons found well-designed library buildings with gardens and reading rooms. In Baghdad, a scholar in the 10th century could visit the library of Shapur ibn Ardashir, a public library with some 10,000 volumes available to readers, or that of the scholar Ibn al-Nadim, or many others. The Grand Library of Tripoli in Syria had so many books that when Crusaders sacked the city in 1109, it supposedly took them 17 days to burn them all, a tragic footnote illustrating how extensive these collections were. Crucially, Islamic libraries were often open and outward-facing. Many were attached to madrasas or mosques and welcomed scholars of various backgrounds. They employed translators and copyists full-time. Some even loaned books under certain conditions and innovation in library service. For example, the library of the scholar Rashid al-Din in 13th century Persia had written rules. Researchers could use books on site freely. To borrow a book, one had to leave a deposit worth half the book's value and return it within a month. This is a remarkably forward-thinking policy, essentially a lending library with library cards in medieval times. There are also accounts of libraries in cities like Merv, where patrons could check out dozens of books at a time, and the librarians kept track of loans. Book culture was vibrant. Booksellers' shops thrived in every city, and private individuals prided themselves on personal libraries. In Baghdad, one 10th century book lover listed so many bookshops along one street that it evokes a Golden Age equivalent of a bustling bookstore district. The societal role of these libraries was profound. They enabled the Islamic Golden Age by facilitating learning, debate, and innovation. Scholars in Cairo or Samarkand, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, could access texts from Greece, India, or Persia in Arabic translation under one roof. The cumulative effect was new discoveries in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, literature, and philosophy, all documented in books that then entered the libraries for others to build on. Furthermore, the knowledge preserved and enhanced by Islamic libraries didn't remain confined to the Islamic world. From the 12th century on, as Christian Europe began to revive intellectually, a great transfer of knowledge occurred. Scholars in Spain and Sicily obtained Arabic manuscripts and translated them into Latin. Thus, the works of Aristotle, Euclid, and others, saved and expanded upon by Islamic librarians and scholars, flowed into European libraries, seeding the European Renaissance. In this way, the library networks of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo served not just their own societies, but ultimately the world's intellectual heritage, acting as a bridge carrying ancient wisdom forward and adding countless new contributions along the way. Renaissance humanist collections. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was ready to rediscover the treasures of antiquity that had been preserved by monks and imported from the Islamic world. The Renaissance was born in Italian city-states like Florence, where scholars hunted for long-lost Latin and Greek manuscripts and found them in monastic libraries or brought them from the East. As these works of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and others came to light, a passion for collecting them took hold among the educated elite. Italian nobles and early Renaissance popes became great patrons of libraries. They viewed the gathering of books as both a cultural mission and a status symbol. In the 15th century, Cosimo de' Medici in Florence amassed a magnificent collection of manuscripts, which he later housed in the Laurentian Library, designed by Michelangelo for scholars to use. Around the same time, in 1452, the Duke of Urbino built a library in his ducal palace that was renowned for its carefully curated collection of classical and humanist works, beautifully copied and bound. Renaissance libraries often took on an air of grandeur. They were built as stunning rooms with carved desks and painted ceilings, reflecting the idea that knowledge itself is a treasure worthy of a palace. One major development was the founding of the Vatican Library in Rome. Pope Nicholas V had the vision of creating a library for the Roman Catholic Church that would be for the common convenience of the learned, essentially an institution to rival Alexandria of old. He and his successors collected thousands of manuscripts in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, hiring scribes to copy texts from across Europe and Byzantium. In 1475, the Vatican Library was formally established with separate reading rooms for Greek and Latin materials, and a learned scholar, Bartolomeo Platina, appointed as librarian. By 1500, the Vatican Library held over 3,500 manuscripts, an enormous collection for the time, making it one of the largest in Europe. Similarly, secular rulers built libraries. The Visconti and Sforza families in Milan, the Estas in Ferrara, and the King of Naples all founded significant collections. In Hungary, King Matthias Corvinus created the Bibliotheca Corviniana, one of Europe's first great libraries outside Italy, containing about 3,000 precious volumes of literature and science by 1490. These Renaissance libraries, though smaller than modern ones, held copies of nearly every important text known at the time. They represented a conscious effort to recover and compile the knowledge of the ancient world, as well as to support contemporary scholarship. The Renaissance also witnessed a transformative technological change, the invention of printing with movable type around 1440 to 1450. The printing press dramatically increased the number of books in existence. By 1500, printed books were spreading through Europe. Libraries gradually began to acquire printed works in addition to manuscripts. Initially, printed books were viewed almost like another form of manuscript. Many were even printed to resemble handwritten books. But over the 16th century, libraries shifted from holding one-of-a-kind handwritten tomes to holding multiple printed volumes of newer works. This change meant that libraries could serve broader practical needs. Collectors in the late Renaissance started to include books of practical information and current scholarship, not just ancient classics or religious texts. A famous example comes from the Duke of Urbino's library. After printing took off, the Duke created a second working library filled with printed books that scholars could use for research and discussion, whereas his older library was more for display and legacy. We even see libraries beginning to collect items we would call archives today. Letters, state papers, technical manuals, and other documents were gathered by enlightened rulers who understood their historical value. In this sense, the Renaissance bridges the medieval and modern worlds of libraries, keeping the reverence for books as beautiful objects, but also embracing the idea of information access and preservation of a wider range of materials. By around 1600, the pattern of great libraries as centers of learning was well established in Europe. The concept had also spread beyond Italy. The French crown's library grew in this period, as did collections in the German states and elsewhere. The role of libraries remained largely for scholars and elites. These were not yet public libraries for the common citizen, but they increasingly fostered research and the sharing of ideas. Academies and universities were often closely linked with these collections. For instance, Oxford's Bodleian Library was refounded in 1602 by Sir Thomas Bodley and explicitly made open to scholars of all nations. This spirit of open scholarship was a Renaissance legacy. We can imagine a scene repeated in many cities of the 15th, 16th centuries. A grand reading room with wood-carved benches, learned men hunched over volumes of Plato or newly printed maps of the New World, a librarian priest or humanist quietly fetching books from armoires, a hush of studious devotion, the scent of ink and leather, and the shared belief that by studying the wisdom of the past, one might illuminate the future. It was a calm, earnest pursuit of knowledge, very much in the tradition of that ancient Egyptian idea that libraries are a healing place of the soul. The rise of public libraries in the modern era. As we move into the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the story of libraries turns toward access for the general public. The idea that ordinary citizens, not just monks, scholars, or the nobility, should have access to books gained momentum with the spread of literacy and Enlightenment ideals. One early step in this direction was the creation of libraries that, while not fully public in the modern sense, were more inclusive than private, aristocratic collections. For example, in 1598, the Francis Trigg Chained Library was established in Grantham, England. It was housed in a church, with books literally chained to the shelves, but anyone could come read them, regardless of affiliation, a notable openness in an age of religious strife. In 1602, as mentioned, Oxford's Bodleian Library reopened and welcomed the whole Republic of the Learned, meaning scholars from anywhere, not just Oxford insiders. Over the next decades, a few city libraries opened, e.g. a city library in Norwich, England in 1608, and in the American colonies, the Library Company of Philadelphia in 1731, which was a membership library but aimed to serve the community of readers. These early libraries often operated on a subscription model. Members pooled funds to buy books and shared them. They were the precursors to free public libraries, expanding access gradually. By the late 18th century, circulating libraries were common in cities like London, lending popular novels to paying customers and thus bringing books into middle-class homes. The concept of the library was shifting from a temple of knowledge to a service for readers. However, at the start of the 19th century, truly free public libraries were still rare. In Britain, one oft-cited example of an early public library was Chetham's Library in Manchester, founded in 1653 per the will of a philanthropist, which allowed anyone to read inside for free. Chetham's was an exception. Most towns had no public library at all. But the Industrial Revolution and the spread of education created a demand for wider access to books. Reformers argued that libraries could help uplift the working classes by providing education and constructive leisure. This led to the landmark Public Libraries Act of 1850 in Britain, which, for the first time, empowered local councils to establish free public libraries supported by taxes. Soon after, cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and London opened public lending libraries where any person could walk in, get a membership, and borrow books for free. This was a radical and democratic leap. The idea spread. By the late 19th century, public libraries were spreading across Europe and North America. In the United States, the Boston Public Library declared itself open to all, with the motto, "Free to all," etched in stone. Other cities followed. Public libraries became, in the words of one 19th century report, palaces for the people, offering educational resources, reading rooms, lectures, and a quiet refuge in bustling cities. A key figure in the expansion of public libraries was the Scottish-American industrialist Andrew Carnegie. After earning a fortune in steel, Carnegie devoted much of it to philanthropy, especially the building of libraries. Between the 1880s and 1920s, he funded the construction of over 2,500 library buildings worldwide, including about 1,670 in the United States and 660 in Britain and Ireland. Carnegie libraries came with a simple deal. Carnegie would pay for the building if the local authority agreed to pay for its ongoing maintenance and staff. This model spurred towns large and small, from New York City to tiny rural villages, to establish permanent public library services. By the early 20th century, the image of the free public library, often a handsome brick or stone Carnegie building at the town center, had become a proud symbol of community self-improvement. Libraries were now seen as engines of democracy, giving every person, rich or poor, the opportunity to read and learn. They extended beyond books, too. Many offered public talks, literacy classes, children's story hours, and other educational programs. Librarianship also became a professional field during this era, with the founding of the American Library Association in 1876, and figures like Melville Dewey introducing the Dewey Decimal Classification for organizing books. As the 20th century progressed, public libraries adapted to new media, adding music records, then films, and eventually digital materials. But their core mission remained. They became one of the most trusted and beloved public institutions. In cities ravaged by wars or economic hardship, libraries often stood as pillars of continuity. For instance, during the Great Depression in the 1930s, American public libraries saw usage soar as unemployed citizens turned to books for solace and self-education. And during the World Wars, libraries conserved paper and guarded collections, sometimes literally hiding books to protect them from destruction. By century's end, in much of the world, the library was an integral part of ordinary life, a place where a student might do homework, an immigrant might learn the local language, a retiree might read the daily newspapers, and children might discover the magic of stories. This transformation, from exclusive archives of kings and scholars to open doors for every curious mind, is one of the most heartening threads in the history of libraries. Archives in the digital age. The latest chapter in this long story brings us to the digital age, where libraries and archives have transcended their physical walls. From the 1960s onward, computers began to revolutionize how libraries manage and share information. At first, this meant internal changes. Libraries started using electronic catalogs and databases to track their collections. In 1971, the creation of Project Gutenberg marked the beginning of digital libraries by making the text of the U.S. Declaration of Independence available electronically, the first e-book. Over subsequent decades, as computers became more powerful and networks connected globally, libraries expanded their mission to the digital realm. By the 1990s, the rise of the internet transformed accessibility. Libraries put their catalogs online, so anyone with an internet connection could search for books remotely. More boldly, libraries and archives began digitizing materials, scanning books, manuscripts, newspapers, photographs, to create electronic collections that could be accessed from anywhere in the world. This was a natural extension of the library's mission. If the goal is to make knowledge accessible, then why not use the newest technology to reach people beyond the building? A digital file can travel to remote villages or to space stations, carrying knowledge with it in ways Gutenberg's paper could not. One of the iconic projects of the digital archive movement is the Internet Archive, founded in 1996. The Internet Archive set out to archive the World Wide Web itself, as well as to collect digital copies of books, audio recordings, videos, and software. It now hosts millions of public domain books that anyone can read for free, effectively a giant digital library accessible from one's home. National libraries, too, launched ambitious digitization programs. The U.S. Library of Congress, for example, created the American Memory Project to scan historical American documents and images. Europe's libraries collaborated on Europeana, a platform uniting digital items from museums and archives across the EU. UNESCO and other international bodies support initiatives to digitize the manuscripts of Timbuktu, the scrolls of the Silk Road, and so on, aiming to preserve humanity's heritage in digital form for posterity. Libraries also began to offer electronic books and journals to their patrons, evolving new services for a world where information is as likely to be in the cloud as on a shelf. A modern public library might provide e-book lending, online research databases, and even digital archives of local history. Digital archives now extend to preserving born digital materials as well, such as emails, websites, or digital photos that have no physical original. Librarians and archivists are adapting centuries-old principles to challenges like format obsolescence, information overload, and ensuring equitable access to technology. Yet, for all the change, there is continuity. The digital age has amplified the reach of libraries, but not altered their fundamental purpose. Whether it's a clay tablet in a Sumerian temple, a papyrus scroll in Alexandria, a leather-bound codex in a medieval abbey, a printed book in a Carnegie library, or a PDF on a server, the goal has been to collect knowledge, organize it, preserve it, and share it. In fact, today's buzzwords about information management echo concerns librarians have voiced for ages. The ancient Library of Alexandria grappled with how to catalog its vast holdings. Medieval archivists worried about preserving documents on fragile mediums. Every era's librarians used the best tools at hand: scribes and pigeonholes, then printing presses and card catalogs, and now computers and cloud storage. So we find ourselves in a world where you can tour great libraries virtually, where a researcher in Australia can read a digitized manuscript from Florence without leaving home, and where our collective cultural record is expanding faster than any one institution could house physically. This democratization of information is the fulfillment of a dream long dreamed. We might recall the inscription over Pharaoh Ramses II's ancient library, the House of Healing for the Soul. In a real sense, the internet-connected libraries and archives of today are a global house of healing for the soul, offering knowledge, solace, and inspiration to anyone, anywhere, at any hour. And as we gently close this journey through time, we can appreciate the long, unbroken chain of care. Countless generations of nameless scribes, librarians, archivists, and visionaries have curated and guarded the lamp of knowledge and passed it onward. From clay tablet to cloud server, the formats have changed, but the light remains the same, a steady, illuminating presence through the ages, inviting each of us to learn and find peace in the accumulated wisdom of humankind. That concludes tonight's lecture. If you're still awake, thank you for spending this time here. If you drifted off somewhere along the way, that's exactly as it should be. New lectures are released each Sunday night. Until next time, rest well.